It's like everything is going off the rails, but it's like in a stagnant kind of way. And then there's awareness that that's happening and a sense for like the dislocation of being pulled in two different directions. And of course, it's like, if this was all arbitrary and we could just program ourselves willy-nilly, like surely this wouldn't be a problem. But yet there's something there. It's like a compass bearing that's still like holding a course in contrast to the drift. And maybe it's like really the conversation of awakening is like connecting with that essence of ourselves on some level.
Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Multiversity Project. Today we are going to be discussing how to transcend the culturescape and awaken your extraordinary mind. If you like this episode, be sure to click like, subscribe, yada yada yada. That really helps a lot. Today for this episode, we are going to be joined by special guest Matti Rivers-Moore.
So transcending the culturescape. Each of us is born into a culture that gives us certain unconscious rules and codes to live by. Some of them are bullshit and some of them are not. Following these codes is a good way to lead an average to good life, but to aim for something extraordinary requires breaking that mold. Drawing from the book The Code of the Extraordinary Mind by Vishen Lakhiani, today we are going to be talking about how to transcend the culturescape that surrounds us and awaken to an extraordinary mind and an extraordinary life. A life where instead of being a slave to the external world, you can become an author of it.
In our journey towards building an extraordinary mind, we're going to be hitting on 4 main stages. Stage 1, how to break out of society's bullshit rules, or brules. Stage 2, how to expand the power of the inner rules of our mind and the outer rules of our world. Stage 3, how to leverage happiness, flow, and spiritual focus to massive success. And stage 4, how to affect the world and design a new culturescape.
We'll also be touching on specific exercises that you can do to prime your mind for this kind of shift.
So on to the first stage, how to escape the shackles of the culturescape. Vishen coined the term brules, which is pretty simple to understand. It just means the bullshit rules of society which keep us trapped in small lives. A lot of times these rules have been developed over centuries and millennia and may once have served a useful purpose, but are useful no more. Others are customs and norms of a more recent origin. So what do we think of this concept of brules? Can we identify some brules from our own lives?
Maybe we can give an example of common brules first to help clarify the concept. Like one that he brings up in the book is this idea that you need to go to college or university to have a successful career. A lot of people are questioning these days.
Have you guys specifically set out to find and break rules or break rules that you're not sure if are rules or not?
I felt like, so for me, this part of the book, there are some elements of review to it in that, I imagine like all of us to have gotten to this extent of questioned a lot of what's come up. For me, like a really basic rule that came up for me was facing, and this is old hat for me at this point, but facing the contention of drug use and like who's to say what functional drug use looks like and at what point it becomes, you start to denominate it as like dysfunction. And like in university, I started meeting all of these people who were probably would have been qualified as addicts by, my parents, but who were like, this is just what they like to do on the weekends. And I guess there was a layer of judgment there around, from my parents around, it's like the nefarious code of drug culture and the fact that it was like diametrically opposed to living a good life in any sense of the word. It's like there are prescribed ways to destroy your life, or like at least not add to it in any meaningful sense. And I know that's one that I personally like worked against for a long time because I was always just curious about these experiences, and it was like an extension of this curiosity in altered states at large. And I always felt like a certain amount of guilt or shame in actually representing myself as part of that culture in a way that didn't threaten my, like supposed professional integrity or whatever. And it's like, only recently, I think, with the whole, it's like the psychedelic renaissance and all this stuff. It's like now cannabis regulation, that a lot of this stuff is starting to come on side, is like a lot more tolerable than it used to be.
That's a huge one. That's a huge one. And that's one that like society seems to be starting to question a little bit as well. Like you mentioned, like Johns Hopkins just opened up an institute for psychedelic research. That was a big one for me. Like I was very opposed to any sort of illegal drug use or anything like that at all. I guess another thing that could be considered a brule or could be considered a rule is the equation of legality with things that you should or should not do. I think that's, most people take laws as unquestioned, like nothing would be illegal if it could be beneficial, but that's not always the case in my experience.
Oh man, this is like totally getting into the deep level right away, but one thing I kind of question about this brule thing is like it brings up like some Jordan Peterson questions of like this idea like there's like this impulse to just throw away all the traditional wisdom and be like, I'm gonna create my own rules for life. But then there's a certain stage where you come back and are like, wait, maybe there's something to the traditional wisdom that actually makes sense. Like, I mean, one example that crops up for me is like when I was a kid, my mom was very anti-sex work. Like she was always like, it's terrible work. It's really bad for women. It's really damaging. Like, stay away from any kind of work like that. And she was very hard line about it. And then when I went to university and like got into like feminism, a lot of the third wave feminists were extremely pro sex work. And they were like, it's feminist, it's empowering, it's fun, it's a way for a woman to explore her sexuality and all this stuff. When I actually met women who were involved in that kind of work and in the field, and like I bought the whole it's empowering thing. Like I was like, yeah, no, it's non-judgmental. But when I actually met people who were involved in it, it kind of seemed like my mom was right. Like it kind of seemed like it was a pretty damaging kind of thing to participate in. And so it's this idea like there's a temptation to just throw away the rules, but like is there some extent to which we're maybe throwing away the baby with the bathwater?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know. That's a good example. An example for me was one thing that I was very adamant was a rule for a long time was the institution of monogamy and, just having one exclusive romantic or sexual partner. I dove very deep into the idea and practice of like non-monogamy, polyamory, and it really fit in with a lot of my ideals about freedom, about abundant love, about being able to overcome certain emotions like jealousy. I still don't think that was necessarily a mistake, but after several years of going the opposite way and being fully non-monogamous and like, this is right and monogamy is restrictive, I started to wonder like, wait, what if there are some actual advantages? Maybe it's a lot more, it seems like it's a lot more emotionally stable. There are some biological components to jealousy that for many, if not most people, make non-monogamy like quite a bumpy ride, not to mention other risks. So yeah, not everything you think is a brule is going to be a brule.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the non-monogamy thing because then you have how non-monogamy has built in certain justifications that like jealousy is healthy and it's okay, right? Like it has just built beliefs into supporting the fact that, supporting the choices that people have made in that field rather than simply just affirming that it's like you want to be non-monogamous because you want to. But it's like without trying to like justify it or rationalize it as like the better system. But like you're drawing we kind of touched on this before we started recording earlier yesterday around the sort of culture and countercultural swings that you were talking about going through. And what really sticks out to me is not so much that it's like the rules are inherently bullshit, but they're bullshit when we don't have agency over which ones we're attending to,
Yeah, that's a really good metric, I think, because there's a lot of rules or brules that They're just in the environment around us. We're not even aware that they are rules. We just don't even think about any other possibility. So there's no choice involved. But most of those cultural norms and rules can be questioned, and then you can choose the ones that work for you. But it's probably a mistake to go the full countercultural swing as well and just assume that like everything that the culture does is wrong, which is something that I did for a while.
Which kind of touches on what you said about Peterson. Yeah.
Yeah, and you just end up in like a secondary system of rules, or like monogamy is a great example, because it's like there's all the justifications for monogamy, and you can just reject those and end up in non-monogamy. But it's like, yeah, then you're just in another system of rules that you mistake for reality.
Yeah, exactly. I made a rule that monogamy is always bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the non-monogamy culture in the West tends to like exceptionalize itself by like contrasting itself with like non-Western non-monogamy, like polygamy and other societies and stuff like that. There's a whole thing.
Yeah, and it almost seems like there is a misrepresentation of freedom happening in each swing. Like, oh, well, those rules weren't real, but these ones are. But without necessarily being conscious that you've just switched over to another set of rules. And rather than choosing, kind of like, and he talks about this experience as well, right? Of sort of cherry picking through his spiritual traditions and finding what worked for him, which I think is very common these days. Like, I don't know a lot of people who are devoutly religious in any sense of like aspiring to be like loyal to one tack. It's actually fairly unusual to stumble into that. And it seems people are more and more at home with kind of cherry picking their way through their experiences, especially because we live in the era of like so much freedom of information that it's hard not to be swamped in, it's hard not to see the contradictions, that might have otherwise been masked.
And that's sort of the danger of like cherry picking is like, yeah, like if you're like taking a whole system like Christianity and you're like, I'm going to be a Christian and I'm going to try to really follow it. And like your prime drive is to just really understand what it's all about and to follow it as it's intended. Then you're sort of forced to hit certain edges, like as you'd say, like you're forced to like come up against the contradictions and really grapple it and like grow and change through that process. But if you're just cherry picking, like it's almost easy to just take whatever you like from different traditions and just conform them to your existing subconscious system of rules. Like if you want to, like, you could have a system of rules that's like, you might have just absorbed the norms of like Western liberal democracy. Like, okay, I want to be tolerant. I want to be nice to people. I want to be compassionate. I want to help the environment. So I'm just going to take whatever from these old religions fits that, and the parts that don't fit it, I'm just going to ignore. And you're not really challenging your rules. You might think that you're challenging because you're challenging these old systems that you never really believed in anyway, but you're really just keeping your whole system of rules intact.
Well, I suppose it depends on your reason for being tolerant. Like, you just listed a bunch of desires that could have actually been authentic desires, or they could have been like, tolerance is what makes you a valuable human being. And if you're intolerant under any circumstances, then like, that's, whatever, then like having that built in is different than I suppose like choosing the qualities that you want to embody, and then you're like, oh yeah, here's a religious and or like political system that matches things I want to see in the world.
I see both sides because like on the one hand, you don't want to just accept a system or a religious system as is, as truth, and then like import all of their rules and put it on your life because you've chosen to accept this system. But on the other hand, if you have some preconceived notions of what you believe and you go cherry picking from different traditions, then you can construct a system, like you said, Ariel, that just suits what you already believe, but also you can create something that's maybe much more unbalanced, whereas things that have survived for a long time, it doesn't necessarily mean they've survived because they're balanced, but there might be something good about the parts that you don't like that you don't realize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the parts you don't like might be like the stepping stones for like a journey into the shadow.
Yeah. You mentioned something, Matti, about like a lot of rules, the kind of the standard rules that we get, and then the swing to the counterculture rules, like both being based off of like a false notion of freedom. for me, I know that was a lot of it. I mean, specifically, I was like an anarchist voluntarist, so like totally driven by freedom. And then I was driven by freedom in all other areas of my life, which is where non-monogamy came in as well. And it also came into like, I didn't want to have a regular job. I didn't want to set any working hours for myself. I didn't want to have a home-based location. I didn't want to own very many physical belongings because I was trying to maximize freedom in one sense. But I wasn't. Freedom also includes freedom to restrict yourself or focus in some certain areas as opposed to just being completely unfocused and having as many options as possible in any given moment. If you can't direct yourself, then you're not free to pursue like deeper ends that take more commitment.
Yeah. Well, and it almost strikes me as like an excess of chaos generates its own problems. And maybe like, and then there's that tried concept, that sort of platitude that there's freedom in discipline, you know, that there's structure provides a different form of freedom. And it's almost like a really basic freedom to want to throw away all the rules, but then realize that you're like, for me anyways, like in the absence of rules, I just end up helplessly swimming, like drowning in like a loss of meaning, or like an inability to self-regulate my life, which is not is the pendulum swing to the other side, it seems. And there has to be like a moderating influence between those two. Now we're kind of getting into like the yin yang theme of like how this resolves into like a middle way almost.
It makes me think of like your mom disapproving of drugs. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if your life is chaotic and like your home is a mess and you're in precarious with your job or whatever, and like if your life is chaotic, then it tends not to be a good idea to do drugs, because it can just wipe away whatever remaining order you have, or you can, you know, it can leave you mentally strange if you're already in a place where you're surrounded by chaos and you're ungrounded. But if your life is really orderly and you have stuff pretty well worked out, then it allows you to like open up pockets of chaos and creativity in a way that's safe, in a way that's constructive instead of destructive. Like your life is able to withstand the chaos. Yeah.
Well, and I think a lot of this, like the emphasis on this conversation for me is all around the agency. It's all around being conscious of like how these things impact us rather than just taking them as rote. And that's the distinction. Like if I understand the rules and I'm able to apply them selectively based on my circumstances, which are ultimately stemming from, what circumstances call for, and I guess on a deeper level, what I'm calling for in my circumstances, like what I'm wanting to create, then is it a brule? Like if it's consciously adopted, even if it's a 9-to-5, like maybe I just need that structure. And I love that structure, then I have no complaint if that person's doing it, taking on something like that consciously.
Yeah, I think anything consciously adopted and like really consciously adopted is not a brule. Where you get brules are the things that you just adopt without even knowing that you adopt them. Vishen Lakhiani in the book brings up an example that's like very extreme of something that in one context could be a brule. He brought up an example of when he was visiting a tribe in the Amazon, and there are very basic cultural rules that humans drink water. Well, these people didn't drink water because there was no safe water source there. They made some kind of fermented drink that sounded pretty gross to me, but they liked it. And
it was their only access to water, moreover, so it was like...
Hydration.
Yeah, hydration. But really, I think what this section of the book is about, or this section of the process is about, is just realizing the field of assumptions that you're swimming in.
It's interesting because it makes me think, like, in a way, like we talk about the like culture-counterculture swing, and then what happens after. Like I almost sometimes suspect that process is necessary. I feel like sometimes you can only really understand like the depths of the rules of society if you really reject them and you go somewhere else and you look at them from a place that's not in them. Because it's one thing for me to say like, I don't know, we should tolerate all belief systems or something like that, or we should always be tolerant of other people. Like, that's a rule that's pretty common in our society, and there's probably a lot of value to it. But if you never question it and you never really say, maybe we shouldn't, then you can never really, I feel like you never really grasp it. I feel like you can never really grasp something unless you've been away from it.
That's an interesting question. I've wondered that because I say, like, maybe I was unwise to swing completely chaotic counterculture, but I don't know if I could have gotten to where I am without that. But then there's certain things that you don't want to question. Like, in order to know that, like, murder is bad is a true rule and not a brule, do you have to go kill somebody and see how it turns out? Like, do you have to really...
Well, maybe you need to question whether murder is always bad. But I see your point.
Maybe you can question... I think you can question things without engaging with them or diving into them. There are some rules that are so high stakes to break that it's probably better not to...
Well, I was talking about questioning them conceptually, not literally breaking them necessarily, but I see the point.
I think it also, like, it's interesting because the murder thing touches on the consequences of breaking those rules, but, like, very specifically, like, what are the real consequences? Like, moralizing aside about whether it's, like, right or wrong to kill someone. If you kill someone, here are some consequences, which is that, like, the legal system is going to come down on you, like, you know, which is a very expensive endeavor. So even in that sense, like, that choice is not, doesn't have to be about moralizing. It's just about, like, well, if I kill someone, these are, like, the plausible consequences. Are those consequences I'm willing to take on just to honor an experiment? And, like, if someone's really gung ho about, you know, jumping into that experimentally, I guess, like, I mean, ultimately you are your own agent. No one's going to make that decision for you, but I would assume, I'm assuming a lot of people, you know, do not go that path because they see the consequences and understand that it's, like, not really in their benefit, to their benefit. What were you going to say?
I don't know. I mean, I used to believe in violent revolution. Like, I used to believe this whole society needed to be taken down by a violent revolution, and a lot of people would have to die / be killed.
I think but conceptually, that's very different than, like, actually killing someone.
It is very different, but it's also in some ways not very different.
And it also assumes that you're going to get your way. Like, if someone told you that the revolution is going to be crushed as a result of your uprising, you know, I'm not saying that would be the consequence, but certainly it probably would be if it wasn't big enough, right? Like,
there was definitely times when that didn't concern me, but then it began to concern me.
I'm glad it did.
It's not, I don't know if it is different. It's definitely different to believe in something than to actually do it, for sure.
Yeah.
Or to actually be in a situation to do it.
Yeah.
But in a way, it's also not that different, because if you look at revolutions that actually happen, it starts off with, like, having a lot of people who believe that it's the right thing and who believe that they're going to do it. And then some circumstance just shifts, and then suddenly they're doing it. It can happen really quickly.
Well, that's an interesting case of, like, a group of people, like, the number of people that believe in something, or the people that it's like a cult following is just one crazy person until you get enough people around them, and then it seems like then it's a religion, or then it's a following, it's a movement, it's a mob, whatever incarnation of that it looks like. But it's like the more people, like, believe in that view, the more likely it is to potentially, like, seed something real. And in a positive or negative sense, like, absolutely, you got like, I mean, arguably, it's like, you know, Trump acting as, like, an access point for more public bigotry or something like that. You could look at that as, like, permission, in a sense that it might be just enabling honesty on some level, but maybe, like, encouraging people to express themselves. What am I trying to say here? That the more people get on board with something, the more it seems acceptable, because that's just the nature of how social rules work. as this sort of like peer networked understanding of social proof, right? It's like if everyone's doing it, it's fine.
Yeah, if everyone's doing it, it's fine. And also, the more you hear it, the more likely you are to believe it. Like, it reminds me of that kind of marketing cliche that like you need to see an ad 7 times to want something. I think that we get accustomed or like acclimated to ideas in the same way as we get acclimated, or not acclimated, but in the same way as we get persuaded to think that we need a product or something like that.
Yeah, and this is the argument in favor of hate speech laws. It's the idea that if you allow certain things to be said over and over again, then it makes it more likely that the ideas being expressed will lead to action.
Do you think it's a good idea? Hate speech laws is an example of that kind of. Do you think it's a good idea to, like, for yourself or for others or even legally or whatever, have certain rules that are untouchable that you're not supposed to question at a very base level?
You know, what comes up for me is that the number one source of brules growing up as a child, and I think Lakiani touches on this, is the inability to ask, or like the inadequacy of a parent's answer to the question why. Why? And eventually you hit the baseline of because. Just because I said so. Like it hits some kind of like authoritarian nerve where the person's just like, you know, like some kind of control thing comes up. And presides rather than acting from benevolence and reason. So I imagine if a law was implemented in such a way that it came off as benevolent and reasonable and compassionate, then there may be no reason to oppose it, really, if it was articulated like in a way that everyone understood. But it's almost like in the forceful execution of a law that it creates more of like a backlash if people, you know, are asking why and not getting the right answer, or not getting an answer that satisfies them at any rate.
I mean, it's tough.
I mean, a forceful execution is what distinguishes a law from a suggestion or like a guideline.
Right, but it's an understanding of like the origination of the law, I suppose.
So if it's like people understand the logic of it versus like that just feeling it's coming out of the blue.
Right.
Well, yeah, like if a parent strikes a child and the child doesn't understand why is the child served by that. It depends. I suppose if like the child was like runs out in the middle of the street and the parent grabs them forcefully, there might not be time to actually explain to the child why they need to get out of the road. But it's an example, I guess. But that is a specifically like compassionate implementation. It's about harm reduction rather than. I don't know what the opposite of that would be. Like it's violence in service to compassion. It's forceful, but it has a benevolent aim, and that aim can probably be referenced or like explained in retrospect as like this is for your own good, and I can show you why, rather than shortcutting it just to like this is for your own good, take it for granted, or like take me at my word.
Yeah, that is Lakiani's distinction that he makes is like you know for sure that something is a brule if when you ask why it's the case they can't give you an answer other than just like this is how it is, man. But I don't think that's the only thing that distinguishes it, because there are plenty of rules that, like, for example, go to college, which we may or may not consider a brule. I think it's not a hardline rule for every smart person that they should go to college, but go to college. If you ask your parents, why should I go to college? They're not going to say because I said so. They're going to probably like have a bunch of important reasons and statistics to cite and like talk about how, you know, the majority of employers require a college degree. They can take you online to look at corporate jobs and stuff like that and show you what kinds of requirements are listed.
I kind of want to go back to this question of if there's any rules that we think shouldn't be questioned. The one that immediately comes to mind for me is don't rape. It's hard for me to think I can't imagine any. For me, that's a rule. For me, that's a rule that is obviously good to follow. But there are people who question that rule, like people like Rushby, who basically says that rape should be legal on private property. And it's tough because there are some rules that aren't necessarily, that produce a better society and are in the interest of most people, but not necessarily in the interest of everybody. Because if you're like, I don't know, some guy who never has sex and has a propensity for violence and low empathy for other people, then maybe being allowed to rape would be good for that particular, would be good for you, would be good for that particular person, even though it's obviously not good for other people. And so then you end up with, I don't know that justification, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I was just thinking, because you were saying if someone needs to understand why the rule.
It's interesting.
I feel like there are certain rules like don't rape where if you have somebody who needs an answer for why, then like they're already gone.
Well, it almost seems like we have these, and maybe we can look to sort of like the cross-religious, or wisdom traditions in general. Basically study this, it feels like, as a whole. It's like what kind of certain immutable laws govern human welfare and culturally, like in terms just behaviorally, or in terms of like how we should regard each other, that creates like the best collective reward on investment, or return on investment. And like the whole who's the guy who said who was arguing for rape on private? Rushby. Okay. So, I mean, and that sounds like an instance of somebody prioritizing like their needs over the collective to a high degree. That sounds socially dysfunctional. Like, I wouldn't want that person being part of in my culture, to be honest, personally. But it sounds like a balance in that as well. Is like, can I honor myself and the collective at the same time, or at least find where those cross over? And I suppose maybe like mysticism and wisdom traditions are kind of about finding those things, because often like politicized law and like statecraft doesn't necessarily honor the like authenticity of that middle way between like honoring the collective or honoring the self.
The thing is, though, like looking at the intersection of different traditions, like you said, is often a good guide. But and I agree with you. Like I don't want the rule "don't rape" to be questioned in my culture, and I find that pretty despicable. But like that rule in particular is an interesting one, because it's one that basically all of us can agree on now. But that's not a universal rule, like through religions and through cultures, like throughout most of time and most of history that I'm aware of anyway. And like even up to the 90s in some states in the US, rape was perfectly legal within a marriage.
Right, but there's a difference between legality and, for instance, like the parables of Jesus, or like the Ten Commandments, or like do unto others as what's the
do it. Although in the butt, do unto others as you would have them do unto
Thank you. So there's some like basic moral precepts in religion. Like, yes, there's some weird shit that happens at the fringes as well, I'm sure.
I'm really not aware of any religion that's like super emphasized consensual sex between marital.
It definitely didn't. And the Bible in the book of Joshua, I mean, it can be read as condoning rape for sure, like rape by conquest. Like when they conquer all those peoples, they basically take the woman and children
the Crusades,
for
right?
themselves. Like that. Like
war.
like that is rape, right? There's no other way to interpret that.
It's hard for me to imagine like what good could come from questioning a rule like that. There's this argument that happens a lot. It's been happening a lot on the internet and in colleges lately, which is like, should all ideas be debated? Because the fact is, like, a rule like don't rape, I think that like good debate coming from good faith with intelligent parties on both sides, the rule don't rape is gonna win. But just opening up that debate, some people are going to be swung to the other side, whereas maybe it was a conversation that was never being had before.
It's definitely a conversation. I mean, it's weird because like there's kind of two ways to look at it. Like the reality is we are living in a society where there are people questioning that. Like it's not just Rougevi. Like he kind of represents, like he has followers. There are some corners of like the manosphere thing where they completely question all women's rights.
Yeah.
Including, the criminalization of marital rape and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's people thinking it. There's people who are already saying it in their own corners of the internet. And there's an idea that if people are saying something, then it needs to be said.
I mean, I think this comes, to me, like the backbone of this is sovereignty of consciousness. Like, that's what I keep coming back to. Like, you do whatever you want to yourself. Frankly, I think it's ludicrous that suicide is illegal, probably on an enforcement level, but I think that's largely like a suggestion of like, yeah, maybe this is, there are better options. But once it comes to affecting other people, to me anyways, that's a really clear line. I don't know, like we could get into whether that's an authentic rule or not.
I generally agree with you. And like, I'm very libertarian, but like, the sovereignty of consciousness as a rule does not apply in most cases for most people. And if that's the only justification for, like, if that's the justification for not raping, and that's like the principle, then we have to question why we're not applying that principle in other ways. Like arguing for our basic moral rules that we hold so dear and like so base is actually really tough.
Wait.
Well, it's a difference between arguing for the moral rules too, because obviously, I don't think it's okay to like. That's not a controversial thing for me. The controversial thing is to what extent the debate on that should be stifled, or to what extent the debate on different issues should be stifled. Like, I think for us, the controversy probably isn't sovereignty of consciousness. I think to some extent we probably agree with it to a large degree. The controversy is to what extent debates on these controversial issues should be stifled.
Well, but I imagine it's not so much about the debate as like, let's have the debate. But when somebody offers like a rule that flies in the face of some very basic tenets of humans getting along functionally, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong in discussing them. But is that the same as promoting them? And I guess this is the hate speech.
That's a question. Like, I don't think it's the same as promoting them, but I think we have to acknowledge that like the consequence of discussing topics and framing them as a controversy is that some people will be swayed to another side. And like some people who would have never questioned that will question it. And of those, even if the arguments are bad, like some people will be swayed to the side that we really don't want them to be. Like on the flip side, if debate is stifled, then you're setting things up that are really important to be rules. And if debate is always stifled, and we see this like in the parts of the manosphere that question like if rape is wrong or things like that, they can say like these people won't even debate us because they know they don't have an argument and it's just a brule. I mean, they don't use that term. That's not their lingo, but that's basically what they're saying.
It's a tough thing. Like it's sort of in a way it like mirrors the debate between like psychotherapy and CBT. Psychotherapy is more based around the idea like your psyche is like a cohesive whole, and it's important to explore every dark corner of it and bring all those dark corners to light so that you can address them consciously and increase the like harmony and coherence of your inner world. Versus CBT, where it's more like your psyche is more like a random assortment of things, and you just want to focus more on the things that you like so that those things grow, and the things that you don't like, just don't focus on them. And it's a little bit like that model being applied to society.
I mean, and it should be noted that like CBT has a lot more evidence behind it.
That's being questioned now. Psychotherapy is undergoing a renaissance.
Okay, so it's the question everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some issues with CBT not like kind of being exposed as not being deep in its applications. Like it's almost too loosey-goosey with its concepts of reprogrammability in the sense of like, and there has to be something to like keep that programming together on an internally coherent level. Otherwise, like, yeah, it's just gonna fucking drift. Like you just wrote new brules for yourself. Congratulations. Like new veneer, but has that really changed anything? Which is an interesting conversation.
You haven't really dealt with your subconscious desire for your parents. Joke, Freudian joke. I'm sorry.
No worries. I thought you were talking to me directly for a second.
Okay, moving on.
Well, I guess we generally want to say, like, question the rules of society, but you don't want to create a rule around questioning everything all the time. You know? You don't want to create any kinds of absolute untouchable rules for yourself. Like, even if...
This is getting into that interesting inquiry as to like whether there are certain objective ways to live better, and that gets complicated because it starts to sound like bruling, and yet a lot of our like wisdom systems seem to suggest that there are like strong overlaps between what different cultures have found to be like ideal ways of living, granted outside of like in an ideal sense, and perhaps it doesn't always like execute cleanly that way through like the mess, the telephone game mess that is culture. But we see these like recurring ideals, and very few of them have anything to do with exercising violence freely against other human beings.
Right.
Like that seems like a glaring hole, and if somebody has a strong opinion on that, it almost calls into question the integrity of their psyche more than anything else, more than their willingness to question. Like it's like, or perhaps question to such an extreme that they become like they've lost touch with like their heart. But that's and I know that's kind of a fuzzy way of putting it, but I guess, you know, there's also this idea that the heart has a sort of compass bearing quality that the mind does not really have access to. And so there's some of these like storytellings around or justifications that can dangerously go into like, oh yeah, you can explain whatever you want, however you want to justify anything, but does it really like sit with this kind of, I don't know, with accessing like an expanded sense of consciousness?
It's kind of the ultimate countercultural swing, right? Like you were bringing up that like basically most cultures around the world have some general wisdom about what are better ways to live, and they don't all agree, but there's something, but violence against other humans usually doesn't have anything to do with it. Questioning that and going against that would be like the ultimate.
Well, they do. Almost every culture around the world has prescriptions against violence towards others in the in-group, indiscriminate violence towards others in the in-group, but many cultures are ethnocentric and condone all kinds of violence against the out-group.
But arguably that's a blind spot. Like that is an ethnocentric blind spot that deliberately, or like not deliberately, but unconsciously contradicts the rules that they're trying to set out.
And from our perspective of Western cosmopolitanism, it seems that way.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is like a culture that has a morality set up that allows it to conquest is more likely to succeed in conquest and like more likely to expand and grow than a culture that does not have provisions for conquest and like does not delineate between the in-group and out-group. Like if you set up a culture with rules to treat everyone with nonviolence and respect, like hopefully you have a lot of really good self-defense memes within your culture. But if you don't, you're going to get wiped out. Even if you have the self-defense memes, like you're probably going to be a smaller culture than the cultures that have this like expansionist mentality. And like even our Western cosmopolitanism, like Western cultures are so like we've colonized more than anywhere in the world.
It brings to mind this story of like when Sparta conquered Athens, and at the outset, like externally speaking, like based on appearances, Sparta appeared to win because they won on the ground. They killed the most people. They, by all accounts, like conquered. But then it was like Athens was a hotbed of culture and Sparta was just like culturally bankrupt. So Athens ended up just kind of like taking over from the inside out. And this is a really curious instance of like the colonized sort of taking over the colonizers, but in that very like yin indirect sense that doesn't really find its way into the history books because of course like the victors write the history books, but it's like whose paper are they writing it on, whose language is there, are they writing it in? And we see that here as well. It's like even cultural appropriation is like, is that actually like the colonizers taking over, or is it like the colonized infecting the colonizers? It could kind of swing either way.
Yeah, it's interesting because historically, not always, but a lot of times in places, the most effective colonizers haven't been those that have carried out indiscriminate violence towards every outgroup, but they've been colonizers that have, to some limited extent, allowed the outgroup to continue their culture and to continue living in a way where they had some level of satisfaction with the situation. Not always. There's definitely been brutal conquests that have been very successful. It doesn't seem to be a total dog-eat-dog world.
Yeah. We're a little bit far away from the topic of brules right now, maybe.
I've got one on a more like nuts and bolts concrete level. I find a lot of resistance to looking people in the eye on the street. And I actually have a rule that staring at people is inappropriate. And, it's like you see kids staring and then their parents are like, don't. It's like I have some kind of bookmarked memory of that being like a thing that's also culturally common and is sort of casually enforced between parent and child. But beyond that, it's like then the extrapolation of that is that it's not okay to talk to people on the street or to be too forward. Like there's certain rules to me around like how I should apply nicety in casual interaction, like how forward and direct I can be with stating my needs or with communicating like impact or what's coming up for me. Like how honest can I be with someone in a moment? It's weird because it's not an explicit rule like you can't do X, but it's more like there's an ingrained resistance to it. Like this feels unsafe, but I'm not really sure why. And to me, that kind of almost touches on the more insidious rules that are like comfort zone.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of things that are maybe rules in the context of like relatively safe, well-developed, rich Western cities are rules now, but are absolutely not rules if you're living in a dangerous area. Like if you're living in a dangerous part of town, like, yeah, you don't walk around looking people in the eye because that can be perceived as a threat. But if you're in like a nice town in Canada and everybody's still following this rule, then someone who breaks it and starts looking people in the eye might get noticed more and meet more people because people aren't primed for threats in the same way. So you have to... This was kind of what we said in the intro. A lot of these rules served a very useful purpose and still serve a very useful purpose in a specific context, but they might not be useful in the context that you're in anymore. The context often changes before the rules catch up.
The college thing comes to mind. This is quick because before the internet, standardization of information was both expensive and like it was expensive and necessary. So, of course, you had to educate within like very rigid streams. And that's how we developed that standard. And now it's like freedom of information has had us questioning that, I think. But like there was a time when like, yeah, you absolutely should. And like you can probably learn to be a doctor online effectively now. From what I've read in multiple podcasts, people like doctors reporting that, it's like med school is basically on iTunes at this point.
Wow.
But like, you still want someone to stamp that with approval if they're going to be, undergoing these delicate operations. So it's not so much that like the information's all out there, but that's not the same as having the certificate of approval sort of thing.
Nor is it the same as having a mentor and actually doing things like in person in the flesh.
Which would have been like apprenticeship which is even like pre-college, right? Like,
Yes.
Yeah. This gets into sovereign individual stuff because they would say that if the certification can be attained in a different way that's cheaper and easier, then the certification is going to become worthless as time goes on.
Well, I think we've identified like a lot of brules or potential brules for people to chew on, right?
Yeah, we've sort of covered our section 1. So basically what we're going to talk about now is once we've identified the brules of society, the next step is building new systems to replace them. Because you can never be absolutely nothing. Okay, so how do we create our own systems of being in the world? Because it may be easier said than done. So what do you guys think? I mean, Matti was just talking about just having the inside of itself of authorship, the idea that you don't have to just absorb rules, but that you're able to create your own is like a major stepping stone.
or at least choose from them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a major stepping stone. We touched on this idea of the counterculture swing, which I think, well, I know me and Ariel went through something like that. I don't know, Matti, if you would say that you went through like a extremist counterculture swing at some point, but that might be part of the process. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe if there was more education about this, it wouldn't be necessary for people to go to the extreme and like construct all these like rules that are just the opposite of whatever they were taught, and then try to synthesize. Maybe they could break free without going through that.
Maybe. I mean, I'm sort of two minds about it because, like, on one hand, I can see, like, I think there is value in, like, rebelling against what you were taught and realizing you can do that, and then realizing that you can synthesize your own system. Because, I mean, I almost feel like, in some ways, like, kids that are raised with, like, high degree of permissiveness or a super, like, open, rule challenging kind of system, like, that almost becomes the rules themselves, like the idea that you can challenge anything, and then once you're there, it's like, how do you rebel? If you're just accepting the idea that you can challenge anything because you were taught it, I guess it can go two ways. It can either like lead to like maybe you're starting off at a really high place, so you're going to go to even higher paradigms, or it could just lead to like it's almost like you've got like nothing to push back against, you know?
Yeah. Well, you still do have things to push back against. That's an interesting point. Like, for the most part, like, although I was raised in maybe a kind of mainstream liberal political paradigm and like ideological paradigm, my parents were relatively open-minded, permissive, and, you know, encouraged me to explore and question things. And I remember one of the things that I questioned, and probably like one of my biggest rebellions, was like I had a very young marriage and then divorce, which was like a very rebellious thing to do. So like people can, I think there is like this impulse to just swing against what they were taught.
Well, it almost sounds like you just summed up a midlife crisis.
And it's interesting because 100 years ago, I mean, I guess the divorce part would still have been unusual, but getting married young would have been more typical.
It's interesting because I'm thinking of a partner I dated who was married at the time, and like our relationship didn't last, but it kind of acted as a catalyst for their divorce. And the level of internal conflict I watched her go through in terms of even justifying the like okayness of her actions, you know, of like even being willing to, even being able to assert her own needs above the value of maintaining a picture perfect marriage was like a massive personal struggle for her. And she did break through it in the end, but I think there's it feels like that deep internal conflict is again like the kind of the substrate of a midlife crisis, where it's like everything is going off the rails, but it's like in a stagnant kind of way that we're not consciously consenting to, and then there's awareness that that's happening, and a sense for like the dislocation of being pulled in two different directions. And of course, it's like, if this was all arbitrary and we could just program ourselves willy-nilly, like surely this wouldn't be a problem. Like there wouldn't be any inherent like sense that like this is wrong and I don't like where this is going. But yet there's something there It's like a compass bearing that's still like holding a course in contrast to the drift. And maybe it's like really the conversation of awakening is like connecting with that essence of ourselves on some level.
With that compass bearing.
With that compass bearing.
Yeah, I do often refer to my experience as my quarter life crisis.
Like a fifth life crisis.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting the comment about the compass bearing and being pulled in two different directions, because it seems like with a lot of these midlife crises and like divorce and stuff, it doesn't necessarily seem clear to me that there's like an authentic self pulling in one direction and like a false bad self pulling in a different direction. Like it seems more that there's just two directions.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's two selves that are at war, and it's not clear which one is to be listened to.
Yeah, I mean that seems like the reality of what we live in. And I think that's part of breaking out of the brules, is realizing that like there are multiple ways to do things that aren't necessarily right or wrong. Like we talked about this with monogamy, like it doesn't have to be that this is always bad and this other thing is always good, or vice versa. It can be that there are advantages and disadvantages to multiple models. I think breaking free is like recognizing that there's not necessarily a right answer and being okay with that uncertainty. But then there's also a time where you have to be okay with the uncertainty and make a choice.
It's interesting because this gets into like Nietzsche, right? Who was maybe like the ultimate rule breaker, like beyond good and evil, right? Because like a big part of his projects was just showing how even our ideas of morality, of like good and bad and good and evil, are basically brules. Like they're cultural constructs. That was his whole argument. And he wanted moral thought to be on a level that wasn't polarized, where there wasn't a polarization between like up and down, good and bad, good and evil, but where it was just like a field of different things. Like there was violence and there was power and there was compassion and there was this and there was that, and they were just sort of floating in a field, like a field of whatever. And that was just the basis on which you made decisions. There was no polarity to like enslave yourself to.
Right. You're deciding what values that you want to maximize and how you want to balance them, and like what other, like if you want to maximize compassion and creativity and freedom, and also you want to throw in a little bit of stability, and you want to like balance those in a certain way, as opposed to like saying, I want to be good. Now, what is good?
Yeah, exactly. Like he would say, what you described, like coming up with your own system of values that's personally empowering. It's like being an Ubermensch versus either having a slave morality or a master morality.
Well, there's, it strikes me that I'm thinking of like David Hawkins, who has a scale of consciousness that goes from 0 to 1,000, and it sort of maps these levels of consciousness as like going from sort of like shame, guilt, anger. Like you sort of have this to more rarefied states of joy, basically. And I don't know a lot of people who would choose anger over joy if they legitimately had the choice, fully informed. So there almost seem to be like states, and I guess we'll get into this later because this is part of Vishen's whole thing too, that our minds are like, we seem to operate more coherently in. And so to me that introduces like this interesting sort of absolutist undercurrent, because there's like the Nietzschean, or what I heard in that is almost like the landmark, like meaning-making machine role play of the mind, where it's like we just assign meaning to things, so everything is, there's no judgment about something being good or bad, but there certainly is a judgment of workability. And I think Vishen really taps into that later, because that's really the pitch he's making around like happiness as being like actually a cognitively functional piece, rather than like a hedonism.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Like on one level, on a purely intellectual maybe there's this field of values, like Nietzsche would put out, and you can choose which ones you want to maximize. And maybe anger is no better than happiness, and you can choose anger if you want to choose anger. And like that's true on one level, but on another level, we are biological beings with certain drives that are kind of innately programmed into us, and there are certain states that we're driven to, or that we usually prefer, like happiness. And there are certain things like, or I guess just rules that cooperation, when everyone is cooperating and trusting, like leads to more prosperity for everyone than if everyone is destroying each other, even if destroying one person might lead to more benefit for you, like outside of a cooperative context. So like there are certain states that seem preferable. You could choose to ignore the human programmed preference to thrive and reproduce and feel good and experience pleasure and experience joy and love. You could choose to ignore those drives if you wanted to, but your brain's probably not going to function as well, like at any other goal that you want to do.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like you guys have one foot in the world of good and evil and one foot out of it. I mean, Nietzsche is a great example because Nietzsche was like, lived a life of misery and resentment and anger and hatred. I mean, he also experienced a lot of joy and love, but he definitely was writing in a lot of very negative emotion, but he was a genius and he wrote these books that we still read over 100 years later and that have like, you know, had this unimaginable impact on the world.
But was he a genius sheerly because he had negative emotions?
Well,
they played into it's in his writing. If you read his writing, he's so hateful in his writing. Not hateful, but he's very angry and resentful and at times hateful, but he's self-consciously so.
Well, that is a huge distinction. And I'd almost add that it's like our culture, I don't think it's a mutual exclusion thing. Like it's not either or. We have like esports and competitive sports, and these are basically reincarnations of military conquest, but they've been tamed and like put in context where we can exercise violence and conflict in ways that are like cathartic and healthy and don't actually cause like direct harm to people. So it's like, I don't even see that we necessarily have to do away with anger. It's not like we're going to live in like a hippie like utopia where conflict is just like an outdated mode, which sounds like a recipe for total suppression, ultimately. But that there's room to express these things when it's done from a place of self-consciousness and self-awareness. And that seems to be what you're speaking to in Nietzsche. It's like he wasn't just raving mad. He was like aware of it, and that made it palatable.
He was also like legitimately angry and miserable though. You can do that and be successful. Like Ariel has a point. I guess I do have one foot in good and evil and one foot in this field. Well, I wouldn't say I have one foot in good and evil, but I have one foot in a purely intellectual space. You can choose what values you want to maximize, but I do maintain that there are certain values that are more aligned with who we evolved to be, and certain values that are more aligned with like harmony and flourishing, I guess, if you choose to value harmony and flourishing. But there are certain values that we're predisposed to, and there are also certain values that our brains are predisposed to function better in. Like cortisol, for example, stress has all kinds of negative health consequences on the body and like consequences on your ability to focus and like consequences on your longevity, consequences on basically whatever you want to look at. You could choose not to value longevity or productivity or focus or like any of those things if you really, really wanted to, but there is like something to peace over stress that isn't just arbitrary.
It's very unusual that people seek self-destruction.
Well, I mean, some stress is good though. It's like eustress.
Yeah.
We just happen to tend to have too much stress in this particular society.
Stress is like an emergency alert, like.
Well,
it's motivating. It's stimulating. It creates. Yeah. I think there's functional benefits as well.
Yeah, like they've done studies where they compare students who are very stressed out, mildly stressed out, and not stressed out at all. And when they study and do a test, and the students who are mildly stressed out do the best.
Right. So it's like that concept, like getting up on stage, and the adrenal rush is actually what carries you through into the intensity of the moment to deliver something that's like worthy of being seen by like 1,000 people or whatever your audience is.
Yeah.
There's something that can like pop us into a different mode of consciousness that's almost related to a moderate stress response.
Okay, maybe like just to go back to that example, like maybe I'm wrong that like peace over stress is always good. I think you have a more nuanced point, which is more accurate, but you're still making a point that there is a state of stress that is generally more aligned with success than other states that you could choose to try to maximize. And so it's not totally arbitrary which values people will choose to pursue.
It's not totally arbitrary, because there are like we do have a biological reality that needs to be fed, literally and otherwise. Like, you know, I mean, there's the whole breatharian thing, but it's unlikely that you could have a healthy body if you never eat or drink water, for example. But beyond like kind of trivial examples like that, like the study I referenced shows that if you're studying for a test at a university in a Western society, a certain level of cortisol is ideal. But like that doesn't mean success. Like success is a culturally loaded term. Like once you start making generalizations, like it's hard to know. It's hard to know where the limits of biology are, because maybe like success is built into our biology on some level. Like Jordan Peterson might argue that. Like that's sort of the stand up straight with your shoulders back, rule 1, is the idea that like serotonin in some way codes for success in human beings and in most animals. But it becomes complicated because we don't quite know to what extent these concepts that we're living in map onto our biology, or even like map onto like the existential ontological reality of the universe, and to what extent they're just cultural constructs.
We can't ever know?
I don't know. Not necessarily we can't ever know. There's an argument that we can never know, because there's an argument that we can never escape. There's an argument that as long as we're thinking and communicating in language, we can never know.
Well, as long as we're hypnotized by our language, certainly it will like distort our ability to know anything somatic. That gets into the interesting conversation of like, well, what is true beyond language, right? Is like somatic reality as just like what is sensation, and can we use that as the compass bearing? Like, is that actually what the heart's communicating at that point, or is that where we get any meaningful feedback that sort of like iterates a biological truth that's a truth that's somehow like immutable or withstands the test of like language?
I mean, it's complicated, right? Because like it's like if I do ayahuasca and I have all these insights, and I feel like those insights have like led me to this like deeper truth that's like I hadn't accessed before. That was my interpretation of it. But if I talk to like a materialistic doctor, the doctor might just say, well, you took an illegal drug and you had a hallucination and now you're deranged. So and who is right?
Well, I suppose it's like we could be dreaming right now, but we're largely colloquially convinced we aren't for some inexplicable reason. And but we could just be tripping, right? Yeah, right, exactly. Reality checks, like pinch yourself. check, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
See our live stream on lucid dreaming.
We've somehow colloquially dreamed that. I imagine I'm in agreement that we're awake. For the sake of argument, anyways.
It would be so sad if I was like dreaming about doing a full 2-hour long Multiversity episode.
And then you had to wake up and actually do it?
Yeah.
How would you behave differently if this was a dream right now?
It was a great episode of my dream, guys.
We're really deep in the weeds now.
Well, you know what? I'm not actually sure that we are, because coming back to dreaming, I think, is a really potent metaphor. This is like a little off the beaten trail with Vishen, but because he doesn't really touch on lucid dreaming or anything like that, but that to me is such a potent metaphor for waking into from the dreaming of like our waking life is that, because it's the exact same principle of mindfulness in like the whole concept of a reality check is exactly what precipitates awareness of brules in the first place. And that's the same mechanism that precipitates a lucid dream state. So it's like that mastery over our like psychic domain is like has, you know, this weird, like it's run by the same immutable laws, whether, or it appears to be anyways on a really basic level, whether we're like awake or dreaming. So there's some and this is like the Socratic, like the cave, right? It's like that, all the fucking the Matrix, like all of this is like the the skin crawling premise of like waking from a dream is somehow like a culturally ubiquitous to the point where it's really hard to ignore the import of it.
It's interesting because like with the idea of lucid dreaming, like you learn to lucid dream by becoming more aware all the time. Like when you're more aware in waking life, you become aware in your dream. And then once you're aware, you're able to like have power over your reality. Mm-hmm. And that seems very related to what he's doing here, what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. And then even the implementation, that's like realizing the dream. But then the actual implementation of like harnessing that awareness to design the dream space through like you realize you're dreaming is, I suppose, like the threshold of becoming lucid. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. And then the whole unfolding beyond that is like, how are you engaging with the dream now that you realize it is a dream? And it like, which is exactly the metaphor that Vishen's like, that's the whole framework he's illustrating, I think.
Oh, it's perfect. Because like when you lucid dream, like the process is like, first you become aware and then you become able to lucid dream, but you can't hold on to it. And to hold on to it, you need to come up with a plan. You need to have a concrete goal. You need to have a concrete goal for what you do as soon as you become lucid. Like, I'm going to become lucid, then I'm going to fly. And once you do that, then you're able to maintain the lucidity. And then once you're able to maintain the lucidity, you can do anything with it. It's like awareness,
inner mastery,
reality mastery.
It almost seems like it might not just be a metaphor. I mean, who knows? But I wonder if people who are well practiced at lucid dreaming would be much better at entering into this, like, blissipline. What was the name of the state? Like, I think he calls it world bending or reality bending state that Vishen talks about in real life. Like, I wonder if dreaming would be a good practice field for.
Right. Well, and I imagine that like awareness of one's inner state, like the loss of self-awareness is exactly what precipitates cultural hypnotism in the first place. Like it would never happen if we were constantly self-aware, because we would never compromise our integrity to serve something that didn't fit, you know, unless it was a choice. And then it would be a choice. But when it doesn't feel like a choice, there's like a fundamental disconnect between like the inner world being whitewashed over by some kind of false truth. Yeah.
This has reignited my desire to lucid dream. There's a lot of different ways to interpret dreams, but one interpretation is it's some kind of reflection of your subconscious. And if that's the case, then if you're able to be lucid and self-aware and control your state in your dream life, I think that would indicate that you're very powerfully in control of your mind in general. Like if you see dreams as a reflection of your subconscious, then being able to lucid dream would be a strong signal that you're a highly capable human being in terms of mastery of your own mind.
I would say even beyond that, there could be dimensions of like you can research, like do Akashic research through dream states. Like people have talked about, like I'm sure you could fly and do the like, you know, have infinite sex, money, whatever, to explore material pleasure in the psychic, you know, in the immaterial domain. But then you also read, or I remember hearing like and reading about, you know, the next stages being like, it's like, okay, so how do you meet the part of yourself that's actually building the dream? because you can reorder the dream around you, but like who's actually generating the dream itself, which is sort of like, how do you have a conversation with God, right? How do you talk to the like organizational intelligence that's like designing the experience that you're frolicking around inside of? And then you can turn the dream into that, which is like you want to talk to your, like, I want to talk to who's in charge, you know, like that kind of thing. Or you confront your dream characters about being dream characters and how did they respond, like that kind of stuff, where you, like, speaking of brules, right, like fucking break the system like completely.
It's interesting because it gets into, I think that sort of it's a great illustration of like the exponential curve too, of like this process. Like you start off and you're doing like a daily awareness practice of like reality checking or whatever. And like that's just like it's a daily grind, and at that point it's easy to get bored and to stop doing it. But if you stick with it, eventually you'll be in the space where you're able to become lucid, and then you wake up, and so you're like, okay, I need to come up with a plan so I can like use this like little drop of ability that I've gained, and so you become better at staying lucid, and then you become better and better at it, and then eventually it just like balloons into this whole like powerful tool that you can use to like reorder your psyche while you sleep. And then it feeds back into like awareness again, because then once you're able to do that, it's like you're in the world in a completely different way and you're more aware. So it becomes a feedback loop that just like it's like with Vervaeke, like when he talks about like these, what is it, these self-perpetuating machines in your head, and like, you know, how depression is a self-perpetuating machine that's negative, and there's all different kinds of self-perpetuating machines. Like through lucid dreaming alone, you can build the self-perpetuating machine that's like extremely positive and just like keeps bringing you to higher and higher levels. And I'm sure that's just like one method among many.
Yeah, I mean, like materialism might be completely outdated if we were competent dreamers as a culture. Like, why would you need to own shit if you could just dream about it? Really? Like why would you need expensive cars? Like, I'll drive in a Bentley when I'm asleep. Like, like it's just like the ultimate biological access to VR. You know, like, it comes built in. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah, there's another piece that's coming from it.
Do it.
No, that just around, it's something about you saying about training them. Okay, so this is exactly, reminds me, this is again a little bit of a throw forward, but where Vishen talks about using gratitude and forgiveness to supercharge like alpha wave generation, and that's like, and that the alpha wave state is associated with flow, which is associated with luck, which is with the bend reality paradigm. I know this is like stepping forward a little bit, but
I think it's okay to step there.
And like that, it's exactly the same thing. It's like, so meditation is the cultivation of, is the equivalent to lucid dreaming, because you're building the resilience of those circuits internally, so you can drive a higher level of like authorship over reality. But I'm not even clear that it's like, it's benevolent authorship, and that's the really strange thing about it. It's like, I question the extent to which you can sort of operate on like black magic principles using this stuff, because it's like, it's almost like you get like root access privileges to reality, but only if you have like the requisite capacity for love, gratitude, reverence, whatever. They're all kind of just the same emotionally, right? To like, those are the keys to that access, to sort of like this like machine code level of reality, if you will, or of our own bodies, of our subconscious. It's like almost like these things are off limits if we don't have the like emotional, and maybe it's like a parasympathetic response, like it's like relaxation, like I imagine love is, well, maybe it's a balance thing. Maybe it's because it's like alert but relaxed. But there's something about that that's like able to open new levels of reality internally and externally, which is the really freaky part, or that's the suggestion anyways.
Yeah, Vishen Lakhiani was talking about this a lot, like in section 3, which I think we're kind of transitioning into. Like there's this state of flow, presence, happiness that he talks about, these states that tend to produce luck, rapid success, and overall prosperity. And like you said, he provided a decent amount of evidence, and it seems true in my experience too, that if you can get into a state of gratitude, happiness, love, that this flow state, this highly productive flow state comes more naturally. And like, maybe that would suggest, kind of like we were saying earlier, that there is some reason to not just see the values as a field that you could choose anger and stress and like violence, but there are certain sides of the field which allow you to unlock like just much greater potential.
I mean, there's definitely people we can see who are like extremely successful and do very destructive things. Or not successful, but who are very effective at being very destructive. I mean, like, like Hitler got very far in his goals.
Who was ultimately so tortured that he killed himself, though. I mean, I don't know what that says about his. That's a pretty steep price to pay.
He had some kind of magic going on, though. Like he was vegetarian, and he had some weird like he could like stand in the back of the van like with his arm out for like 8 hours, like just like not moving.
It seems like he had mastered his mind, like he had mastered.
But not his heart, evidently.
Evidently, no.
Yeah.
Well, that leads to a question, like what kind of a place was Hitler? Oh God, do I want to ask that question? Like, what kind of an emotional place was Hitler actually coming from? Did he believe that he was doing the best thing for the world, you know?
It's a tough question.
I mean, it's tough to argue about. My body's like, that's a stupid question, but like, that's...
No,
Well, I mean, the reason why it's relating for me is because, like, if we're saying that you need to access, like, love and gratitude and stuff like that. Oh, God. I don't even want to ask, like, was Hitler coming from a place of love and gratitude?
Well, that's the weird, like, semanticism of it, where it's, like, being a little devil's advocate-y, but it's, like, it doesn't really fit the mold of what I think we expect love to look like, or it certainly didn't have the right impact anyways.
I mean, did he... I would think, from what I've read about Hitler, that he was much more motivated by hatred and resentment, like fueled by hatred and resentment than love.
Right. Dropping out of art school, right? Like,
yeah, dropping out of art school, like he, you know, ton of hatred and resentment against
Jews.
Yeah, Jews and the Poles and the Western European powers that had humiliated Germany. Like, he had resentment against all kinds of groups. And I mean, there was definitely a veneer of, like, love for the German people and apocalypse about, like, the future of Germany.
I don't know if, like, idealization of the Aryan race is love, though, or if it's just, like, worship or some sort of, like, obsession, you know? It's, like infatuation versus, like, genuine compassion.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it love, but I'm more curious if like, was he in, like, an alpha wave brain state? Like, was he in that kind of peaceful, collected Zen mode?
It's hard to say. I mean, is that state necessarily synonymous with love and compassion and all these things, or is it possible to be in a state of, like, I mean, maybe you set your goals in a state of hatred and determination, and then you get into, like, a Zen state and you're just, like, calm and doing things?
Well, so Vishen says that you need to be in, like, happiness, and, like, that forgiveness is the most powerful tool for getting to the alpha wave brain state, like, based on his own experience and based on the program that he went through that, like, used some biofeedback. But we don't know that that's true. Maybe it's about catharsis, and, like, catharsis could come from emotions other than forgiveness or emotions that we normally code as positive.
That's a really good point.
I don't know. I think they're, like, I don't know what other emotions they would come from, because there has to be a release, and lower emotions are usually around gripping. They're about craving
about,
or
like,
aversion.
I cannot relate to this. Like, this is not a headspace that I have ever lived in, but like, I know so many people who talk about how amazing and full of release physical violence feels. Like, there's a lot of people who get like a huge release from like boom, you know, like that's not me.
Yeah, but do they get a release from like the physical exertion or from literally hurting someone?
I think from literally hurting somebody else sometimes.
And from victory and dominance, like yes, like we conquered France.
But those are craving and aversion at that point. Like that's about control and dominance, which is like arguably comes from like that's not a compassionate emotion set, and that's not saying that it doesn't get shit done, because certainly that's what we've seen in the history of colonialism, right?
Basically, what I'm saying is we know that this compassionate emotion state can unlock like flow and alpha brainwave states and all this, but like and Vishen wants to say that that's what we should access, and I agree with him. That's definitely the way that I want to go into it. But maybe you can also access, well, not even maybe, like it seems totally true that people get into a flow state through violence and hate and like that kind of drive. Like I think there are certain people who can unlock something. Maybe like every action movie portrays this.
I mean, how can there not be like some kind of massive spiritual feeling rush when you're conquering the world and it's all you've ever wanted? I guess it wasn't all he's ever wanted, but it was what he'd wanted for a long time at that point.
Right, but it's like consumption of power. I mean, it's just a very crude form of self-appeasement, I suppose. And that's not to discredit it and not to say that it doesn't move mountains in its own right. But it seems to generally lead to people's downfall, whether or not they do a lot of damage on the way out. Like, it's like their body's kind of tearing themselves apart while they're doing it. And so even, like, okay, you know, what came up for me as you were explaining that was like the difference between taking like a really strong stimulant like methamphetamine and being in like a psychedelically induced flow state. Which to me is super aligned with a lot of this stuff we're talking right around, like the gratitude and sort of these, you know, whatever, like psychedelics being sort of like EEG mapped out as having these similarities with like deep meditative states. So there's sort of like the numbers are there. I don't think there's been a lot of studies concluding that like methamphetamine has a lot of like brainwave similarities to deep meditation, but just anecdotally, it's like the control dopamine fueled state of those substances is like really, there's so much power behind them. Like there's a fierceness of will behind them. And yet it has a strangely, for me anyways, it has had like a strangely empty quality compared to like a psychedelic act of magical will, or I don't know how else to call that. So it's like there's power behind it, and yet there's like something else missing. Yeah, that's go.
It's interesting because, I mean, one thing I've noticed about methamphetamine, I sometimes think that different drugs have partners. So it's like methamphetamine in some ways it's like a foil to cocaine. It's like if you do cocaine, you get like dopamine and serotonin. So if I was on cocaine, I'd be like manic and annoying, but I would be like feeling very loving towards Matti or whatever. Versus if I do methamphetamine, I would be very manic and high energy and annoying, but I could feel pretty much anything. Like I could feel a desire to do violence, or I could feel a desire, I could feel loving, or I could feel violent, or I could feel anything, because it's just dopamine. There's nothing pulling it in any kind of direction. And I think like a drug like mushrooms or ayahuasca, like those drugs feel like they have a direction. Like it's very hard for me to imagine someone being violent on like ayahuasca.
Most psychedelics, they increase empathy.
They do. They do. And they seem to have like
which is a side effect of expanded consciousness.
It feels like when doing them, it feels like it's expanding consciousness, and it feels like there's something true and good about them.
Yeah.
Versus like, I don't know. I mean, I've definitely have seen people do some pretty messed up stuff on acid, which is a psychedelic. So it seems like some drugs seem to suggest that there's a directionality to all this stuff, all this transcendent stuff, and some drugs don't.
I remember meeting this guy in a car, telling me about, this was like in my seedier days, telling me about a time that he burglarized someone's house on mushrooms. And I was like, God. What? It felt like a basic conflict of interest. And he was just like, oh, just like, and I was like, okay. I had no idea that was a thing. Interesting choice.
I mean, a thing for us to note, like Vishen Lakhiani and all of us, I think, are like people who are oriented towards trying to be good and trying to do good and like trying to be good to others. So like, as we're learning about transcendent states and exploring them, like we probably have some sort of a bias towards believing that they have a good directionality, or that like nobody could achieve the level of greatness and flow in like a dark directionality. Like you said, like psychedelics do tend to lead to empathy, though, like you just said, like people can apparently burglarize other people's houses on mushrooms, and I can't imagine that. But it might just be, it might be our bias, and it might be Vishen's bias also. I don't know.
The empathy thing to me is a really important piece, because if empathy is a side effect, is just a symptom of expanded consciousness, because literally I'm now like my field is now enveloping yours, or like I'm able to project consciousness in such a way that I can feel what you're feeling, or at least think that I am. That implies a certain responsibility, like, or at least a connection that I can't, like if I'm hurting you, I'm hurting myself. There's like an acknowledgement of basic connectivity, interconnectivity. And it seems to me that those faculties are necessary to create huge social shifts I'm using the word positive here, in the positive direction. Otherwise, like perhaps it's I'm able to exert control in other ways, but is it really serving or informed by an authentic awareness of collective good or interest?
Maybe the missing piece is like psychopathy. Like we talked about psychopathy on one of our more recent episodes. Like for most people, if you got into a state where you had an expanded field of consciousness and you could feel other people's feelings, I think biologically and naturally for the vast majority of people, that would make us want to align with them and not hurt them, because their pain would be our pain. But for someone who was, it could just give them more information to more effectively destroy what they want to destroy. Like they could expand their field of consciousness and like really feel really understand what other people are feeling, and be completely indifferent to it.
I mean, I think it's more complicated in a way, because you like, to get back to the example of Hitler, I guess to like completely Godwin's law this episode, but like with Hitler, like I'm not sure he was a psychopath, because he definitely displayed emotions outside of the predatory emotions. But it like the whole Nazi thing, like they basically had a whole system of thinking that conflated the lower races with vermin. So with Hitler, he saw himself as cleansing Germany from an infestation by, slaughtering, liquidating the Jews and the blacks and the disabled, the mentally disabled and the gays and stuff like that. It was like killing the termites, versus like he was also a vegetarian. So he had much more empathy for, the cows and the pigs and the dogs than he did for the Jews.
Was he a vegetarian for ethical reasons?
Maybe not. Maybe it was health reasons. I'm not sure, actually. That's a good question.
It's an interesting point, though. Maybe Hitler was not a psychopath.
Maybe he was, though. He might have been. I mean, Lenin wasn't. Like, Lenin's in some ways a better example, because he was, he had a lot of compassion. He had a lot of compassion for the workers and for little animals, and like he was known for being a bleeding heart in some ways. But he was definitely in favor of violent militarized revolution that killed a lot of people, and People don't like to look at Lenin so much because he was a more complex character than Stalin and Hitler. But Lenin did terrible, terrible things. Anyway, this is sort of besides the point because we're getting away from this question of if it's possible to be transcendent while feeding on dark emotions.
But transcendent in what? To what end? I mean, it seems like the end really speaks for itself at that point, and to be transcendent with the agenda of that involves harm seems very like paradoxical. And then I can only imagine, it almost seems like there is at best like a false enlightenment happening. Like, yeah, maybe they hit a peak somewhere along the line, some sort of like ability to personally manage their energy and throw it around with some weight. But is that the only benchmark we're using for transcendent?
It doesn't feel paradoxical to me. It feels like the side that I don't want to align with. But I mean, many spiritual traditions, like we talked about the concept of the yin and the yang, or like in Christianity, you have God and you have the devil. And like in many traditional traditions, like you'll have a force for good and a force for evil. Like this is very classic. They seem almost equally strong. Usually good prevails in the end of these stories, but I don't know.
There's a reason good always prevails, and that's because evil and good is a false duality, right? At least that's a lot of the mystical frameworks seem to like allude to. It's like there isn't dark, there's just loss of light. So there's almost, I mean, that's an interesting premise to light always winning. Is that like dark is only precipitated by the loss of light. It's like, and maybe that's why they always have to be together to some extent. But one is more primary than the other on some level.
It's an interesting because it's in a way it's a difference between Manichaeanism and monotheism. Like Manichaeism is the idea that there's two gods, a god of light and a god of darkness, and they're always at war. Mm-hmm. So that's like it was a lot of religions that were Manichaean in the ancient period, like the Zoroasters, and they eventually got replaced by monotheism, which basically for the most part says there's only a god of good. And which is sort of leads into a worldview of like, there's good and there's the absence of good, versus there are two active forces, one of good and one of evil.
Oh, but there's still like Satan, right?
But that's like a whole.
God.
Well,
he's still there's an opposing force.
But Satan isn't as powerful as God.
Right, and that's a good nuance. Yeah, true.
I mean, and Satan could suggest that there's still a pull to Manichaeanism, even if monotheism won.
But the implication is that God is allowing Satan.
And that Satan fell from God.
Right. And he's a basic division of God anyways.
Yeah, so Satan is still the absence of good.
Or an iteration of it, like a twisted iteration.
I mean, that could be like a synthesis. Like that could be what evil is. Like evil is a twisted dark mirror of good. So it's not a clean path, like the path towards good. Like it's like you sort of pointed out before that a lot of these, dark figures who have pursued the path of evil or the path of darkness that we've been talking about, even though they seem like they experience some kind of power and transcendence on that path, they ultimately have a downfall because evil is a twisted path.
That rings true to me. And also just the idea that, I mean, psychopaths aside, like most of the evil figures that I can think of, I don't like using the term evil actually, because I have a feeling that most people who do things that are incredibly destructive are doing it in the pursuit of good. Like evil really is just a twisted good in some way. And if there was like an absence of striving for something, it almost doesn't feel evil. It just feels chaotic.
Are they striving for good? I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, that's a little shaky to me too.
Yeah, I'm not sure everyone has good intentions.
I mean, I suppose you could make the argument that ignorance is more primary than like malice. But then I suppose you could just call like, and then that's like ignorance and awareness as Satan and God.
And I think Hitler was striving for what he thought was good.
Well, this is what we're getting at before. Was he striving for what he thought was good, or was he fueled by hatred and resentment and desire for, naked desire for power?
Yeah, he didn't seem very at choice around his resentment, which suggests that he was programmed by something.
But even if his emotional fuel was resentment, he still, like you said, that he conceptualized what he was doing as a form of cleansing. You can think that what you're doing is good even if you're fueled by anger. Like the dark emotions like anger and resentment aren't necessarily opposed to good. I think a lot of people consider revenge to be good, for example,
But there's justification there, which is the realm of the mind, which has nothing to do with inner compass. That's just making up excuses to justify your actions and put it in a moral light.
Yeah, like I could be like, I don't know, really jealous of Matti for something and decide I'm gonna murder him out of hatred, and I could come up with some kind of intellectual justification for it, like,
He wronged me.
He deserved it for everything he's done to me. Yeah, but it's like, I'm not really doing it because I truly believe, like, the right thing to do would be to kill Matti because he's wronged me so much and it's justice. I don't really believe, like, that's not really the primary thing that's fueled, that's motivating me. The primary motivation is the hatred. And
Which begs the question, is there any world where killing me would actually be, the right thing to do? Or where it would just be, unless it was violence in service of compassion.
I mean, sure, but it's a different situation, right? Like the situation I described is a different situation than one where
Imagine let's say self-defense and you had no choice.
Yeah, you had no choice, or let's say I find out you're a serial killer and I know there's no way the police would never believe me, but that's a very morally different situation. In that case, I might be killing you despite of my love and because I believe it's the right thing, versus doing it out of hatred and justifying it in some rationalization.
I don't know if I can justify this in any kind of way, but I do feel, and it seems like a lot of traditions feel, that good is stronger than evil somehow.
I get really excited by the idea of just being very honest and open about the irrational experience of feeling something is a certain way. And yet there is an element of I suppose, discernment around being able to pick out a feeling, genuinely discern a feeling from a thought. Because people say, I feel, and then they say a thought a lot of the time. I feel like you're not listening to me. That's not a feeling. That's not a feeling. So it's there's a basic dyslexia around even talking about what we're experiencing.
I do think that's a feeling. I do feel that the drivers of good are stronger than those. I do feel that good is primary.
I don't know, I feel like that belief to some degree is predicated on how we judge this society. There's a way of looking at this society where it's this society, we're surrounded by miracles everywhere and these incredible inventions and all these, strange pieces of knowledge that we're able to act. There's a way of interpreting the society very positively, and human beings are doing better. There's a way of interpreting it positively. And if we interpret it positively, then we interpret the arc of history as thing we seem to be building. We seem to be building and making things better and making things greater and making things more peaceful. And if you interpret things that way, I think it's easy to believe in good, because then it seems like history is magnetically pulled towards good in a way. Versus if you consider Western civilization, or more largely human civilization, to be evil, then maybe it's easier to interpret it as to get into ways of looking at the world of human nature is pulled towards evil.
I don't think I can explore this properly. I've always had an orientation towards good. It could be because of how I was conditioned. I've never spoken in depth with anybody who has an orientation towards evil or who doesn't see good as stronger than evil. Like I've spoken to people like that a little bit, but I tend to really avoid those types of people. And I feel like our society tends to really avoid listening to those types of people also, probably for a good reason. So like, I don't know how much wisdom they have or if their arguments are as strong. But
There's, I think it's Panzer or something like that. There's a specific, just the topography of serial killers is fascinating if you want to study like exercises in evil. But generally they seem to come from some sort of tortured past. Like there has to be a precedent for that kind of violent discharge to happen in the first place, which speaks to like a deep sense of like needs not being met and just like fermenting until it's like a rotten core and it takes over the person's life. Like to me, there's something very like asynchronous about the ability to commit deep evil that probably makes it like super jarring to be around.
Could we flip it though and say that like in order for people to have an orientation towards good, there are all of these needs that need to be met?
Yeah, and maybe I would. It's like it seems like the stage probably has to be set in some way, or can be stacked in your favor, and in the spirit of self-authorship, it's like ultimately the responsibility falls on you at some step on the path too.
One thing that really stood out for me in 12 Rules for Life is Jordan Peterson at one point says, one of the strongest arguments that exists for good is the fact that people generally are better at raising their kids than their parents were. It's pretty common for people who come from abusive backgrounds to grow up and not be abusive. In fact, like the majority of people who come from abusive backgrounds are not themselves abusive.
Weren't you saying that psychopaths were an exception to that, though?
No, I said the inverse is it's psychopaths are often raised by other psychopaths.
Okay, so it still holds true, yeah.
Yeah, psychopaths are often raised by other psychopaths, but it doesn't necessarily mean that most people who have psychopaths as parents are themselves psychopaths. So the causation, like one doesn't imply the other.
Family tradition.
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson describes it as like the fabric of reality slowly gets sewn back together even when it's torn apart, and that's a strong argument for good.
Right, there's something fighting entropy, otherwise we'd be in perpetual chaos.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Even if we want to take it away from like a moral or metaphysical level, like good is advantageous for a society if like most of the people in it are good in most contexts. Evil only becomes advantageous if you're in a situation where like people are generally not cooperating, or there's not enough resources for everybody, or there's some kind of a lack. And as we get better at progressing, like with technology, one of the nice things about humanity is like we can record information and like get better at doing things and get better at providing for our needs over time. So like the more we progress, the more our needs are met. The more our needs are met, the more people are born with an orientation towards good, because the more it's advantageous for them to be that way. Maybe it's more of like a moral direction or like a spiritual direction, but even if we want to take it to like a purely materialist level, I think it makes sense.
Right. And well, I imagine the impacts of, it's like in past generations or maybe centuries, like the impact of a serious loss of spirit, that's not the right word, loss of spirituality, but the presence of evil might manifest more concretely and densely as massacres, like world wars. Like we still have that happening today, but it's certainly like reduced in frequency and numbers. But now we have things like the evil of consumption, which is driven by greed, which is driven by ignorance, and it's just like a more rarefied form of evil that's still present in some form. It has just like transitioned and become lighter. It's like the baseline is rising in the same sort of like trickle down economic sense of like poverty gradually being eliminated, but wealth discrepancies increasing. So it's like we're getting like maybe more extremes in consciousness, but like the baseline is rising. And maybe the ceiling is rising as well, because now, like you're saying, in the presence of all this like material abundance, we have the time and luxury to ask these questions where we might not have been before.
Yeah, so like with each age of humanity, there's like an upgrade of consciousness, but with that upgrade of consciousness, there comes all these like new challenges and forms of vice, but they are more like rarefied's a good word than in previous paradigms. So like instead of, well, I sort of question myself there.
Well, things also become more extreme because there's more power. Like the individual has just much more power. Like one example would be like the invention of a machine gun. An individual who wants to be destructive can be much more destructive than a destructive individual who is working with stone tools.
Yes.
It's more rare, but maybe more extreme.
Yeah, it's interesting because the scale of recent conflicts has been greater than anything before, like World War II. But the proportion of violence taking place within any society, pretty much, or the vast majority of societies, has gone way down.
But even since World War II, I mean, arguably most of the wars are now like corporate espionage, information, like the entire substrate of war has changed. Now we're fighting war with robots, right? It's like a different level of casualty interaction than in prior battles. At least in like the more advanced sense, I suppose there's still,
It's interesting though, because as that happens, the threat of the old-fashioned violence becomes greater. Like if the United States is a society that's used to fighting battles with war, fighting battles with robots, where the casualty levels are fairly low, then the value of a human life becomes higher, right? Than versus in a society where the men basically have to be cannon fodder.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a way, that makes societies like the United States more vulnerable to something like 9/11, where someone is just able to bypass all those protocols and just kill a bunch of people. Like that hits harder in a way than it might have in the past.
Well, I suppose it hits harder because killing is not as normalized, so it comes as a greater shock.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. Death is a greater shock.
We've been civilized, or violence has been domesticated.
There's actually some evidence to suggest that humans are domesticating themselves over time, not just like violence-wise, but our physical features are of like modern humans as compared to humans 10,000 years ago are significantly more like neotenous, like more youth-like looking, less hair, less chiseled features and stuff like that, which is very typical. It's basically what happens whenever any animal is domesticated.
Yeah, it's funny. This is going to be a little left field, but what came up for me is like depictions of aliens. They're skinless, tall, incredibly physically awkward. Like this thing could not survive in a jungle. It looks like unfit for physical labor. It's almost like driving that like domesticization to like an imagined limit, whether it's like conscious or not. It's an interesting like archetype.
Yeah, and that's interesting because like when we imagine like the human beings of the future, like we imagine, or like if we imagine like the post-human human, it's like, yeah, like that, like bald, genderless, like you're removed from the animalistic elements of our biology.
Maybe like bigger eyes, which suggests youthfulness, like if they weren't so like bug-eyed anyways. Yeah.
We do seem to be moving that direction. There's a reaction against that, certainly. And I don't think that the reaction is all bad. Like there is these things that we're trying to transcend, like these human emotions and the darker emotions, are also part of what makes life very rich. Like if you were just choosing a rational system to construct a a being that would do good, like sex drive probably wouldn't be involved. But I think that's something that most of us value.
And gender too, right? Like there definitely is a very present movement in Western civilization trying to push for a genderless society.
Right, which is fascinating as like as a singularity between the polarities, but it also speaks to like declining birth rates. Like, does that speak to like more of a tantric rather than procreative relationship to sexuality as we're moving forward? And then like in the whole gender bending continuum, it's like, what does physical sexual like sexuality even come into play in a more rarefied form of sexuality, especially if we end up living to like 150 plus years or whatever, right? It's like your priority is not really to procreate or prolong the species at that point, like not with the same urgency.
Yeah, and it's like the purpose of sexual attraction to a large extent is gene optimization. Like you're picking someone with whom you'll be able to optimize your genes. But once we crack the code for genetic engineering, which may or may not be possible, but if we're able to do that, then in a way sex will be obsolete. Sexual attraction will be obsolete. But then just the next question beyond that is, once we're like, to what extent can we engineer a perfect world, and to what extent are these attempts to engineer the perfect world destroying the magic of what it is to be human or what it is to be a being in this world?
I mean, even the very idea of magic is often seen as kind of a... Oh, sorry. There's a baby in the hallway.
It's okay. Case in point.
They're probably just waiting for the elevator.
What comes up for me around parenting as well, actually, is just in a more procreatively geared culture, there's probably not a lot of thought put into, speaking of brules again, whether one is ready or particularly explicitly willing to take on the responsibilities of parenting. It's just like, it happened. And especially like pre contraception, like you really didn't have a choice anyways. It was just going to happen and you kind of roll with it. But it's like in this increasing world of like agency where we choose to have children, I imagine there are people who should actually be caretakers, and probably that is their path, their calling, and like they should be the ones having kids. Or perhaps it's like more of a thing where we can be mindful about the sort of spiritual or like psychic maturity necessary to actually raise children in a way that doesn't leave them worse off than we were.
It's interesting also because like that idea of controlling when it happens, like before contraception, you controlled when and with whom it happened by getting married. That's the control you exerted. And there was really strong social norms. So before you got married, it wasn't going to happen. You pick someone to get married, or your parents pick someone, then you're doing it. Versus now, it seems like it's almost, there's like the class division where a lot of people who come from like less like lower class backgrounds or less educated backgrounds like don't have the same access to contraception and abortion, or in different parts of the world. But because the norms around sexuality and around marriage have been so loosened, like in a lot of those places, it's just like, it is kind of just ad hoc, or like it does still happen by surprise, but there's even like less level of control than there was before, because like there both is less access to these like contraception and these systems of education that allow people to have more control over their sexuality, and the institution of marriage has collapsed, versus like people who are like wealthier, more college educated, have such a high degree of control over when they procreate, put so much almost fastidiousness into picking the right moment that they often miss their moment completely and don't procreate at all, or they procreate quite late and don't have a very small number of kids.
Yeah. But I mean, I suppose that is sort of a form of choice. Maybe it's like a brule in another sense too. But it seems to be whatever. It seems to be more popular. Like it definitely seems to be trending in that direction. I have yet to see any like, or it's relatively rare to see like 7 sibling families. Like when I meet people from large families, it's usually the exception, not the norm.
That's because of where and who you are, though.
But that's my point.
Well, but it seems like the more that society like leans towards this domestication, like highly intellectual, the more rare it seems to be.
Because if you're, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if one is in a less industrialized culture, your workforce is your children. So you want to have a lot of children. Like there's good economic sense behind that as well. I mean, assuming you, again, the thing you mentioned about not having marriage as a backbone is really weird to me, because that would be like really catastrophic, because it's like, yeah, okay, but you're still having a child, and you have to deal with like the economic ramifications of that in a culture where you don't have the welfare systems to support that. So that's going to hit the fan really quickly, you know?
Yeah, well, that's what we see in a lot of places. Like,
yeah,
that makes sense.
I'm becoming aware of the time. It's almost 7.
Yeah, we should be aware of the time. Well, okay. I wanted to get to, like, we got very deep into, like, do we have to choose good in order to achieve transcendence, and, like, what is good and evil? Even, like, we went really deep. But a lot of what Vishen was talking about in the latter portion of the book, which I think is interesting, is, like, given that we choose good, like, what are these methods that we can apply that can help us achieve like transcendence and flow states and like an expanded, exceptional, extraordinary mind? And
yeah,
this is the Blissipline angle, right?
Yeah, the Blissipline angle, the gratitude practices, the way that he talked about how like cultivating positive relationships in his office increased productivity like a bajillion fold. What do you guys think of those kinds of ideas?
That was really inspiring to me. Like he talks about like 2 elements, like the element of like being happy in the moment and of setting powerful goals in the correct way. And so you have like an engine in the present driving you towards an amazing future. And I thought that was really cool. Like I took the quiz and I got negative spiral. So that's not a good level of happiness in the present, and not a good setting of clear goals into the future. And so I guess that was a bit of a wake-up call. I definitely want to work on that.
Is the quiz in the back? Where's the quiz?
The quiz was in the section on happiness, and it was the 8 questions.
Okay. Right, and that's the downward spiral is... So what's the consequence? That's not...
It's basically being depressed. It's like if you're not... Because basically he talks about like there's 4 quadrants. Like there's the quadrant of...
You're suffering in presence and you're suffering in vision, basically.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Like there's 4 quadrants. Like there's the good quadrant, which is where you're happy in the present and have vision and purpose and direction.
Yeah.
And you're moving towards it productively and quickly because you have that happiness to fuel you. Mm-hmm. And then there's having vision and purpose but not being happy, which is like being stressed out and anxious, which I thought was the one I would be in. I mean, maybe I was just being hard on myself in the quiz. That's also possible. But and there's the other quadrant of we call it like the present reality tunnel or present trap or whatever, which
like
is
hedonism, basically.
Yeah, which is where you're like blissful in the present, but you have no purpose. So I don't know, like the hippie state, I guess.
Yeah.
And then there's the bad on both, which is like the negative. He calls it the negative spiral, which is basically being depressed.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also the positive on both, where you're positive in vision and positive in the moment, where you're like accepting yourself, accepting your life, and happy. And as part of that, you're also accepting like the fluid process of like growing and changing and improving, and you have a plan and you know what you're going for. So you're fueling yourself with positivity to the moon.
I definitely want to do that. I mean, I definitely felt motivated to like do these gratitude exercises and practice, like to do his, like he has a 6-stage meditation, which is you basically go through compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, setting goals, planning your perfect day in the present, and then feeling blessing from God. And like it's like a 15-minute meditation where you just like basically go through the whole system really quickly. And I want to start practicing that. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, it's super powerful.
He was talking about people who like
No
start
doubt.
practicing it and then like their work lives improve and all this stuff.
Even, I would say, like, I'm brought back to Vipassana and the practice of metta, and like even saying the words, may all beings be happy, may all beings be at peace. Like the inherent generosity in that thought has a certain frequency, a certain vibration, to me anyways. And if I'm being more conscious of, or I've tried being more conscious of just holding that thought when I am doing unproductive thinking as a way to kind of reorient to the heart and sort of like step back into some kind of like altruistic frame and not get lost in like the bullshit of my life. But there's something about that that's like, because generosity is like the opposite of scarcity. And saying may all beings be happy, even like the act of offering, like presuming to bless others, which is itself a godly attribute, to me is like it has some sort of rewiring effect, I think, if practiced. And that's what he seems to suggest too, right? It's like reverence and gratitude.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it gets into this idea of like, you basically want to implicitly assume the things that you want to manifest or enact. Like instead of like, looking at yourself in the mirror and being like, I am loving, I am loving, I am loving, or whatever. You ask a question, how am I so good at being loving? Or why am I so loving and able to manifest love? So it's like you ask a question that presumes it. I mean, that's a good way to convince other people of things too, right? Like if I wanted to convince, I don't know, Katie that I'm a good person, I don't just go like, Katie, I'm a good person, I'm a good person, I'm a good person. Like if anything that makes you suspicious, I'm not a good person. Like the way I'd convince you is by carrying out some kind of action or demonstrating it in my worldview in some way.
Exactly. This is the concept of show, don't tell in marketing or anything else. Mm-hmm. You have to show yourself that you're loving and worthy and good and can achieve great things. It's like you're searching for all of the reasons that you could be successful, and in doing so, you find new ways that you could apply yourself. And you orient yourself towards noticing the ways that you're doing well, and you orient yourself towards noticing opportunities for doing good. That's another big thing too. Like if you practice something like gratitude or practice something like these meditations, kind of like we were talking about lucid dreaming, like if you're constantly doing reality checks, this is almost like training your brain to do goodness checks. So you're looking for ways for your goals to be achieved, and like you're looking for ways to feel happy. You're training your brain to be in that place.
What did you guys think of the means versus ends goal setting?
That was a little disturbing for me because I began to wonder how many of my goals that I'm working towards are means goals, and it seems like a lot of them are.
You want to clarify that concept a little bit?
Oh, yeah. The idea is that there's different kinds of goals. So there's the end goals, which are goals that we truly care about and are passionate about and the things that we want more than anything else. And then there's means goals, which are...
Stepping stones.
Yeah. So if it's like...
if I had enough money, then I could buy a car so I could live in the country. And you like just want to live in the country. That's the end goal or something like that.
Yeah. And so then you start focusing on money versus like when you become too focused on the means goals, you stop asking the questions like, are there other paths towards this end goal that might be more effective?
Yeah, and even living in the country might not be the end goal. Like most of the end goals that Vishen was pointing to were actually like emotional states of being that we're trying to achieve, or things like rather than having a goal, I want to be married in 2 years or something like that. What's really driving that is like, I want to feel love in my life. And maybe marriage is the path to that, but maybe it's not. And if you get caught up in like the brule about how to achieve that like true goal of like feeling love, then you might achieve your means goal and realize that you don't feel love at all and you don't feel happy. So you wouldn't be focused on like the actual base end goal. I thought that was really good.
Yeah,
brilliant.
he also makes a distinction between self-fulfilled goals and non-self-fulfilled goals. So like instead of having an end goal of like I want to love and be loved by a special romantic partner, which to some extent is beyond my control, I would have an end goal of like I want to be surrounded by love and manifesting love every day in my life, which is within my power to fulfill.
Yeah. And I'm not outsourcing it to other people.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to make a goal about a specific person. Like, you definitely don't want to say, like, I want to date Josh and I want Josh to love me forever.
Yeah, no, you definitely don't. I mean, he seems to even be saying, like, you shouldn't make goals like, I want to have a romantic partner.
Yeah.
Well, I want to have a romantic partner so that I will feel loved is probably like a very bit where I want to have a romantic partner so that I can practice love. So I have someone to like give things to. I suppose that would be very different than like expecting.
Well, there's degrees to this, like, because there would be ways to practice love without having a romantic partner. But like at some level, like most goals are some kind of a means. It just depends on like how deep you want to go. Because even if you want to say like, I want to feel loved, why do you want to feel loved? Well, because I want to be at peace with myself and secure or something like that. Maybe there are other ways other than love.
Yeah, I guess the idea is to try to get as close to the bottom as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the piece around money really resonated with me because I know that that's a very active struggle for me. I'm very captivated by the value of money, and I've had to very deliberately go in and kind of rip those wires out a little bit, or at least just like kind of find where they're feeding me in unexpected ways or like keeping me in a certain pattern. And very specifically it was around, I guess like it's a means goal. It's like if I had enough then I could, but it's also this like almost marriage into the inherent value of money. And money is a symbol of freedom and a symbol of possibility instead of actually going for the freedom and possibility. Like, what does that look like manifest? It's almost easier and yet like more dismissive to just, and lazier, I guess, in a sense, to just like attribute those qualities to money and then problematize the lack of freedom and the lack of self-expression or all these things. Like, oh, you know, it's like if I could dress more colorfully, then I would be like more confident with people. Or if I had a car, I could, you know, whatever. It turns into like modern marketing basically, but trying to like unwind that, while also, I guess, giving money its due justice as like a tool. Again, it's like it's not necessarily like discrediting the means, but what I love that he talks about is like how in focusing on the end goals, sometimes the means come in unexpectedly. Like when he talked about starting A-Fest and how he like never really envisioned that as being the constellation of the things that he wanted, but it just happened that as soon as he was able to like elucidate and name all the things that he wanted, it's like A-Fest came along and he was like, wow, this checks all my boxes. Okay, cool, I guess. Like, never would have thought of this, but, and it, like, as opposed to like driving for a vocation on the pretense that it will fit those things, but not actually knowing until you get there. He's just like, I'm just going to stay open and name those like end goals and stay focused on them. And then like something will just kind of synthesize organically as my brain is sort of like hunting for a solution subconsciously. To me, that was really cool. That's like magic. That
is kind of like the magic. That's like that flow magic reality bending stuff he was talking about. Like if you stay focused on the end goal, you're just primed for everything to.
But you don't even have to do anything with it beyond, like you don't have to figure it out. You can just sort of let the background processing take care of that, which is staggeringly cool. Because I think like in a control-oriented culture, it's like wanting to figure it out and wanting to know every manifest step of the way is so built in that it's almost like nerve-wracking not to do that. And then the nerve-wracking kills the flow. And so it kind of comes back to that like concept of trust and like how willing am I to trust my own instincts and intuitions, which is like a very a vulnerable and like beautiful act. It takes a lot of courage.
Cool. Yeah. Very cool. Thank you. Thank you, audience.
We're all tongue-tied.
Yeah, that is kind of how I feel, though. Like when you were talking about trusting your instincts, I did just kind of take a deep breath and think like, yeah.
Yeah, it almost seemed like you were on the edge of something intense there.
No, cool. I don't think there's anywhere we need to take that. I think we can just leave that as is. This has been a really cool discussion.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
Agreed.
Thank you for coming on this journey with us, audience, watching this far. This has been a lot of fun. If you want to hear more conversations like this, please make sure to like, subscribe, check out our Patreon, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.